702.
News and current affairs.
In this hour, we talk to Ukrainian American political commentator and TV journalist Peter Zalmayev about the peace conversations, peace talks, negotiations that are taking place out in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, between the United States and Ukraine, right? And there's a lot of context here. There's a war that started out 3 years ago as a military operation. There are very, very different opinions about who is right and who is wrong with regards to the protagonists in this particular war. In fact, even calling it a war can sometimes be an issue of great contention, yeah? But there are players. There are regional players. There is the continent of Europe, if you want to call it a continent. There is America and the new Trump administration, and of course, the Russian administration under Putin. There's the rest of the world, and then there's us, South Africa. And I've invited Peter to give us a sense of what it is that the world is watching at the moment by way of... Okay, let me say this, that it just feels like the world is changing, that centers of power are changing, that a different world order is emerging. Some people might say, it's the new world order that everybody's been speaking about in conspiracy spaces. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But that's why we've invited Peter Zalmayev to join us in this conversation, and he is on the line. Peter, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me this evening. I really appreciate it. I know that you are doing quite a lot of work, and you were able to give us a bit of your time this evening. I want to start off by saying, what is going on in Jeddah today? What is the reason for this meeting? In fact, I'm told that some resolutions have been arrived at, but what was this meeting all about? Who called for it? For what purpose?
Good evening, Aubrey. It's a pleasure to be on your program. And just a quick remark you said about an emerging new world order. I would say an emerging world disorder, rather, when the United States is engaged in, a hard sort of confrontation with its main allies, such as Canada and Western Europe, and is voting together with Russia at the level of the United Nations. Really strange times we live in. What we had in Jeddah was a very, very kind of initial step to try to probe the Russian position. I mean, that is a charitable interpretation of what's happening, or sort of continue the process that's already started, between the White House and the Kremlin, along the lines on which both sides had agreed. That would lead to a very unpalatable sort of peace for Ukraine on conditions that Washington and Kremlin had already agreed on. We're kind of operating in very murky waters here, even though a lot of my compatriots are very happy about what transpired in Jeddah. A lot have rushed to say that, well, the course has been corrected. We're back on good terms with the Americans. I would just say not so fast, folks. Yes, Secretary of State Rubio has said the ball is in Russia's court right now. And Vladimir Putin came back with a sort of non-answer. It's just as I predicted. It was neither a hard no nor a yes. It was, yes, we are for peace, but there are nuances. There's fine print. And I think the whole essence of Russia's position on this is in fine print, as a matter of fact. Putin has not budged from his obsession with Ukraine and with bringing Ukraine to its knees and essentially making Ukraine disappear as a sovereign, independent state. My fear is that Donald Trump, in his rush to fulfill his campaign promise to solve this conflict in 24 hours, and that 24 hours has ballooned to first 100 days of his presidency, in this rush, he will make and an acceptable sort of number of concessions to Russia, to where this sort of peace that will be achieved will be a very Pyrrhic peace, meaning that it will be a peace that could be considered a failure of the United States to enforce international norms. But like you said, we're living in a very new world order, or a world disorder, where Donald Trump has abrogated international treaties, has left the Paris Accord, the World Health Organization, etc. I don't think Donald Trump cares a fig about, being the guardian of international peace and being the transactional president that he is. He would rather make peace with Russia, thinking that this is a sure way to weaken China. But we can talk about it later. I think that we can say that it's still too soon to tell what is going to be Russia's response to this. I think Putin's going to try to drag this out quite a bit of time. He does not want to be accused as the warmongering party. But like I said, I think this is a very, very tricky game for Donald Trump, because, at the end of the day, my fear is that Putin will make Trump look weak. And Putin also understands that. So there will be some brinksmanship in the weeks and months to come. But I am very skeptical that we can speak about a full peace agreement with Russia anytime soon. Neither party is ready for that.
You make the point that your compatriots, the people of Ukraine, are happy, at least at the sound of the possibility of peace. And I can imagine that the war has taken its toll on the people of Ukraine at levels that perhaps are not yet comprehensible until sometime perhaps later, when we've had peace. What is it that, in your opinion, the people of Ukraine would like to see? Because that'll give me a sense as to how they, and again, I understand that maybe we're talking about different constituencies when we speak of the people of Ukraine, but how do the people of Ukraine, what would a genuine peace and the terms thereof look like to them?
Well, first of all, I would say that most Ukrainians are now level-headed and cool-headed enough to understand that the 20% of Ukraine's territory that's currently occupied by Russia is probably not going to be liberated anytime soon. And that was not the case even like a year and a half ago. I think the powers that be and our government made a miscalculation in sort of raising expectations of Ukrainians after, remember, a series of victories. Like the first year into the war, to where Ukrainians were promised they would have a chance to be drinking coffee in Crimea very soon. That was literally what they said. We'll be drinking coffee on the beaches of Crimea come next spring. They were talking about the spring, I guess, of 2023. So there's a lot of unrealistic expectations, and we had to do some reality check, especially in the last year and a half, and most Ukrainians realized that we might as well kiss these areas goodbye. As harsh as that may sound, people are fatigued with war. People are fatigued having lived in the last 3 years through hundreds, if not thousands, of air raids. It's something that you have to live through this to understand what it feels like. Yeah. People are traumatized. People have now, every Ukrainian now has a close either relative or a friend who's died in this war. It has affected the whole country, but the numbers are still such that the majority of Ukrainians, not as much as before, but still the majority of Ukrainians would not agree to peace on capitulatory conditions. Yeah. Ukraine wants to be a country, first of all, independent of Russia. It wants to be a country that will have a privilege of setting its own foreign policy course. Once again, we're being told now that NATO is out of the question. Well, the question is then, what other security guarantees can you provide us? Don't forget that in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum that Ukraine signed, that was in return for nuclear weapons that Ukraine gave up. And the signatories were Britain.
In return for what? I mean, I keep hearing that the carrot that is dangled before the people of Ukraine is that we will give you peace, whether we'll protect you, whether it's through the NATO process or whether it is through the US process, which is actually quite interesting, so that we make sure that Russia doesn't invade you again, or we have a situation where Russia is happy enough with whatever is decided upon to not have a reason to invade again. But in lieu of what? So if NATO protects Ukraine, or the United States protects Ukraine, what do they get in return?
What they get in return is a check on Russia. Russia that was allowed to run rampant over its neighbors creates a very, very unpleasant precedent worldwide. Starting with, let's say, China and Taiwan. That is the most immediate and pressing issue, as we know. But geographically speaking, the most immediate such domino effect will be felt in this eastern members of the EU and NATO, the Baltic states, and then maybe Poland, but also Moldova, the little country to the west of Ukraine. And that's why we're hearing now from European officials, such as the defense minister of the Netherlands, who seemed the other day to intimate that Europe is interested in Ukraine continuing to resist and to fight. I mean, that was kind of interpreted uncharitably by some in Ukraine that, they want to continue seeing Ukrainians lose their lives and shed their blood in defense of Europe. That's what we've been saying all along. We're acting as the fortress Ukraine, fortress Europe. It's not just a war for Ukraine; it's a war for the entire Western liberal democratic identity, which will be with a revanchist, victorious Russia, which will come under grave risk to its existence. Now that we have opposition to the very idea of liberal democracy on both sides of the Atlantic, right, all the way in Moscow, and then Washington. All of a sudden, they seem to be making common cause in disparaging the very idea of a liberal democracy. Well, we see some movements now on the part of the Europeans who are waking up to the very clear and present danger to their lifestyles, etc. So they do understand that the outcome of the war in Ukraine goes far beyond its borders.
So Peter, let me ask you this question in the context that says that we've been hearing of late that President Trump has been saying, we will provide you with protection if you give us access to certain minerals and certain minerals and certain resources that are available in Ukraine. We are also hearing that there is, of course, as you've just put it now, that there is a sense that Ukraine has played the role of a buffer between Russia and Western Europe. And that really the fear that Europe has is that if Russia were to be victorious against Ukraine, it would leave Europe very vulnerable to a further invasion by Russia. But you are probably aware of the narrative that says, no, actually, we've been understanding this whole matter wrong. That this is a situation where Russia had been provoked to move into Ukraine by broken agreements for a very, very long time that had been made to say that we would not be seeing an eastward expansion towards Russia, and the presence of missiles in countries such as Poland and so forth, countries that are very much close to the border of Russia, has made Russia very, very, very uncomfortable, even with warnings to say, but guys, you've broken many agreements that we've had that said that there wouldn't be an eastward expansion of NATO. But now you guys have made it a possibility in the mind of Ukraine that they may now join NATO. And that is the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine, not only to stop Ukraine playing the role of the protector of Europe, but also as a sign and as a message to NATO and at the time the United States that you dare not come in here. So my question is, what is the understanding here for the reason for the conflict, the war, at least from Ukraine's side? Is there that understanding that perhaps Putin was somehow treated unfairly by the West and agreements that were made were reneged upon, and that's why is there that sense, that appreciation? Because we keep hearing that.
Yeah. There's much to unpack here, and I'll just say that from the get-go, most Ukrainians would vociferously disagree with that point, and they would consider it sort of a Russian talking point, this kind of grievance that Putin had. And let me tell you, all dictators throughout history, they're always voicing grievances, and they always claim to be the wronged party. Remember, Hitler claimed that the little Poland to the east of Germany was the one who attacked Germany. And Putin, right before the war, that kind of slipped the attention of most of the people, but there was a pretext. There was supposedly some provocation by the Ukrainians in the east of Ukraine, which then led to Putin's decision to attack Ukraine. They're always the wronged party. They always claim to be attacked by some much smaller neighbor. To the larger point of NATO provoking Russia, well, NATO's point, as you know, is that it's a strictly defensive alliance. It never had offensive designs on any country or any neighboring alliance.
Yeah.
Also, keep in mind that Russia is the largest nuclear power. So, what sort of existential threat would it face from any country member of NATO? That's sort of kind of a moot point. I will give. I would give some limited validity to this argument when we look at what the sort of policy that NATO has adopted vis-a-vis Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, also Georgia, the neighboring former Soviet country. And a specific year, I have in mind is 2008, at the behest and at the participation of Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and other European leaders. Ukraine was and Germany and Georgia were promised an eventual membership of NATO, while Merkel and company never really had that in mind. They said, well, down the road, you'll be a member of NATO, but there was no there, as we say. There was no mechanism adopted, or there was no time plan. It was sort of the way the European Union has treated Turkey for the past 30 years by sort of dangling this membership in the UN, basically just pushing Turkey away, which led to Islamization of Turkey and an authoritarian turn under the current president Erdogan. And so this was the worst world where Ukraine and Georgia could have wound up in. And that's exactly what happened. Just short of membership, what did it lead to? To annexation by Russia of parts of Georgia. And you remember that little war of 2008? That was the first such sign that Putin means business, and he's going to try to restore the Soviet Union in some shape or form. That was sort of the setting the course for the future course of action.
But why Ukraine, Peter? Help me understand. Why would the focus of Putin be Ukraine when there are other countries that were a part of the USSR that are now members of NATO? Why Ukraine specifically? Why go after Ukraine?
Let me start by quoting Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, as you may remember, the national security advisor under the late President Carter, a Pole, a Polak or a Pole by ethnicity, someone who understood Ukraine and Russia very well. He said, Russia without Ukraine is not an empire. Ukraine is the cradle of Eastern Slavic civilization of Eastern Orthodoxy. You're probably aware of Kievan Rus, Kievan Rus, the Rus of Kiev. So Kiev as the mother of Russian cities. That's what the Russians refer to. How they refer to Kiev. Putin, keep in mind, Ukraine is obviously the largest former Soviet republic, right. At least in population, and it is related to Russia ethnically, religiously. Let's not beat around the bush, even though it's not a popular thing to say in Ukraine. We are related. We are related in many ways, mixed marriages, etc. And so for Putin, not having Ukraine. He considers this like his very legacy now is restoring this fraternal union between the two peoples. What the minute Ukraine decided to go independent and chart its own course and to integrate with Europe, this was considered as a stab in the back, as a betrayal by a brother or by a cousin. Let's say, if we're talking this familial term. So I think that is the root cause. That is the root cause of Putin's resentment,
and that is
Ukraine wanting to join NATO is just part of it, but it's a much more complex issue that goes back not just decades but actually centuries of Russia trying to subdue Ukraine back when it was a principality under the Getmans and the Cossacks, and when it was not even called Ukraine at that time. Yeah.
So and would that description that you've given me now be the general understanding of the breakdown of relationships between Russia and Ukraine by Ukrainians? Is that how Ukrainians generally understand this whole impasse?
I do, and you have to also keep in mind that the 3 years that we've been engaged in this war with Russia has also concentrated minds and actually changed minds to at a pace completely unheard of. You could not imagine that sort of turnaround that we have undergone. It's almost that Putin and company, they have willed this sort of Russophobia, this hatred of Russia on the part of Ukrainians, which Ukrainians never had. They went ahead and accused us of Russophobia, of hating Russians, of trying to suppress the Russian language in parts of Ukraine that were largely Russian speaking. And by way of full disclosure, I myself am originally a Russian speaker from the east of Ukraine, from Donbass. And obviously there's complete bullcrap. I'm sorry. Those accusations that Ukraine was, cracking down on Russians and ethnic Russians on the use of the Russian language. No. Putin has decided, he embarked on this course to turn Ukrainians into the other, into the enemy. And it sort of, he willed that into kind of coming to be, that sort of hatred and, this animosity that Ukrainians feel for Russia. I mean, there's no better way to do that, to achieve that, than attack the country, start bombing its cities, and then what do you expect?
Yeah. So tell me about President Zelensky, and I'm asking this question in the context of what we saw about 2 weeks ago in that Oval Office shouting match, if you want. What does he represent in the minds of Americans and now to the Europeans who seem to have fallen out of favor with each other? I'm talking about the Americans and the Europeans who've come together to say, listen, we stand behind Ukraine in terms of supporting Ukraine militarily and financially to fight the war. And of course, the scepter of the American narrative in all of this that says, listen, you need us. If we don't give you the protection against Russia, well, you're as good as dead. So you better go the route of peace, but on our terms, which means that you've got to either take certain territories and agree that you're going to hand them over to Russia, but we will also want a portion of your minerals. And my question is that the kind of peace that Ukraine is willing to capitulate to? But I do want to understand Zelensky and his relationship with Trump from the Ukrainian point of view. What do you guys in Ukraine see when you see Trump, and what does he represent for your existential issues?
I mean, I could not whatever happened in the Oval Office. I couldn't call it any other term than a shit show. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to use that language on your show, but that is the only way to characterize it. And Ukrainians were obviously incensed. They were shocked. Most would probably tell you that Trump is very much playing on Russia's side, if not being an outright agent of Russia's influence, then definitely being in cahoots with the Russians.
In fact, I'm hearing people even suggesting that Trump is a Russian spy asset. I mean, is that?
I mean, that's been suggested quite a few times, and remember, it was suggested during Trump's first term when the Democrats, the dossier and the P tapes, you remember, and there were a lot of actors involved in those accusations, and then the impeachment trials, etc. I don't think we have the evidence to talk about that, and it would be irresponsible for me to speculate. We just don't have the evidence, even though the preponderance of what we've heard from Donald Trump sort of points to some really, surprising affinity for Vladimir Putin. But laying that aside, I would say that, now what happened with Jeddah and Trump promising to bring harsher sanctions against Russia if Russia does not play ball, it just shows you that we're all kind of victims of a Stockholm syndrome of the guy in Washington who has decided to base the entire foreign policy of the United States on his whim, on the way he's treated, on the way he's looked at, on the way he's thanked or not thanked enough, etc. This is just sort of the new reality. And as much as Ukrainians despise Trump for the show he put on at the Oval Office and that sort of trap they seem to have set for President Zelensky, now they're sighing with relief at what happened in Jeddah, that all of a sudden Americans and Ukrainians are jointly putting forward a proposal to the Russians of a peace agreement. I would be very skeptical about this turnaround, whether this is a turnaround, etc. We are all sort of hostages of the Stockholm syndrome, of Trump's unpredictability, and we're just playing catch up to Trump's whims. And I think his great desire is for that Nobel Prize for Peace that President Obama got early in his first term. If you remember, Donald Trump has lost sleep over that. And how come his predecessor got that prize and he didn't? That's why all this rush to conclude this peace very quickly. And, with this sort of haste and rush that we're seeing, obviously, I think it's not going to be in Ukraine's favor. And that's my greatest worry.
I need to take a break, but as I take the break, please consider this question. The fundamental argument used by Donald Trump and his administration for the position that he has taken is that they have spent much more, comparatively speaking, than the European Union in supporting Zelensky and Ukraine, and that they have inadvertently been the protectors of Europe, and that they have been, in fact, taken advantage of. And he'd like to see Europe pay their way a little bit more in the situation, which appeals, I imagine, to a certain section of the American electorate, particularly that which supported him. To what extent is that argument about the investment that America has made in the fight against Russia a legitimate one? But two, what do you make then of Europe's response to that? Because I'm hearing Europe saying, and you would have seen the responses by Macron, by the British guy, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, I think his name is. Both of them saying that no, we've actually given these monies freely as a gesture of helping another country that has been unfairly and illegally invaded. We've heard the same from Canada. And it appears that that is a big contentious issue. I want to take a quick break. When I come back, I'd like for you to explain that to us and how that dynamic works in the space. My guest is Peter Zalmayev. He's a Ukrainian American political commentator and TV journalist. I speak to him straight after this.
702 News and current affairs.
Peter Zalmayev is my guest, a Ukrainian American political commentator. We're talking about the conundrum that is the Ukraine-Russo peace deal that seems to have been initiated in Saudi Arabia. That conversation took place yesterday, and it looks like there may be a deal, but my guest is very skeptical of it. And I'm just trying to get a sense of how do we understand all of this from where we sit here in South Africa. And you'll remember that I had a guest a week ago who had a very different approach to this whole matter, and clearly a very different take on the same story by Peter Zalmayev. So, Peter, if you can, the narrative coming out of the Trump administration to say that the reason why we are demanding greater gratitude from Zelensky and greater respect, and for him to wear a tie and a suit and all of that kind of stuff, is because we've given him over $300 billion as a nation. And compared to the rest of Europe, whom we are protecting as the United States, they haven't paid their dues. They are going to get their money back. We're never going to get our money back. And that's why I, as the representative of the United States, Donald Trump, want a piece of the action in terms of the minerals in Ukraine. Talk to us about that. And is that the accurate understanding of what's going on there?
As many things with Trump, talking about accuracy is one thing, and then having a kernel of truth in the larger point is another. And as many things as that we hear from him, there is a kernel of truth in that America is and has been played for suckers in years and decades past, for various foreign adventures and misadventures. Just remember how America went into Afghanistan and Iraq to the tune of trillions of dollars, as Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, has put it, $1 trillion war. And then who were the beneficiaries of that? Well, in Iraq, it was the neighboring Iran, obviously. And in Afghanistan, now China is benefiting from a relationship with the Taliban after America spent blood and treasure in trying to make peace and order in Afghanistan. So, yes, those were situations when America was played for fool. With a situation like Western Europe that America has done so much to bring back to peace and prosperity after World War II, there will always inevitably be freeloaders and free riders taking advantage of America's security umbrella to completely disarm itself, to forget about even the threat of war, to be trading with Russia, etc. And that's what Europe has been doing. And there is a point in Trump's grievance that Europe has not been carrying its share of the burden. If that is the case, then that may be a well thought out and correct strategy to make Europe wake up, to start spending more of its budgets on NATO and its defense, etc. And that was the case in Trump's first term. Now Donald Trump is showing a new kind of determination to just totally burn bridges with Europe rather than sort of correct their behavior. I think he may be going a bit too far in some of his rhetoric and actions and the tariffs, etc. But when it comes to aid to Ukraine, there's a misrepresentation we've heard from him. It's never been $350 billion. Let's start with that. And actually, the actual figure is probably half of that. And Europe, according to calculations by the World Bank and Bloomberg, has actually cumulatively spent more than the United States. I think that is important to make that correction. For Donald Trump to say that, now we have this agreement with Ukraine, we'll sign this agreement and Ukraine will turn over its wealth to us. And I mean, that is, I think, a way for him to show to his electorate that, look, I'm putting America's interests first, etc. It's not really a very actionable kind of plan. Whatever they sign, we don't know how much of that Ukraine has. It will take over a decade to prospect and inspect all of that, these rare earths, etc. And I don't see investors right now lining up to start investing in Ukraine. So that is that's a very, very distant sort of perspective. So I think Donald Trump just wants to, being the showman that he is, he wants to show. I don't think it's really, well, like I said, actionable, etc. And let me just end by quoting. I'm not sure if this was real. We have to check it, but it was reported today that Macron ostensibly said that France's assistance to America in this revolutionary war was not really assistance, pro bono. It was actually a loan. So America now owes France trillions of dollars. I'm not sure if it was a joke, or if it was it was really made by Macron. But I think it's a very salient point when it comes to who owes what and who was, assisting whom, without any sort of expectation of return.
We're hearing from, and I do want to now go into the relationship, the seemingly budding relationship between South Africa and Ukraine under Mr. Zelensky. In fact, I believe he's been invited to South Africa next month for a state visit to South Africa. And I want to sort of contextualize this within the context of the fact that South Africa has remained a non-aligned member of the community of nations, but there has been a feeling in some quarters that South Africa has lent more to the side of Russia over the years, and seemed to be, just in terms of rhetoric, a little more supportive of Russia in this particular war. But of late, particularly since the SH1T show that you talked about in the Oval Office, it looks like there's been a shift where Pretoria is now making friends with Kiev, to the point where Zelensky has been invited. We saw, to be honest, and to be fair, a delegation of African leaders that went to both Russia and Ukraine to try and broker some sort of peace. The success of that is still to be perhaps determined. But it appears that South Africa specifically, in the face of the rather negative attention that it's been getting from America as a result of, certain information and disinformation that it has been given by certain of our own compatriots to the United States about the expropriation bill and the idea that there is a genocide against white people in South Africa, which is absolute nonsense, has been determined over and over again. There seems to be a cozying up of relationships between Ramaphosa and Zelensky. How do you understand that? And what is the end goal here? We're seeing all sorts of adverts and discussions around farmers from Ukraine coming to South Africa. And this happens while America is inviting farmers, South African farmers, white Afrikaner South African farmers, to go to the United States in the midst of an agricultural crisis in the United States. What's going on? This is all very fast. It's happening very quickly and a little bit confusing.
Well, I'll just say that, I think being the major power in Africa that South Africa is, the president is doing only what's right. It has its own foreign policy, and he has the right to choose who to meet with or who not to meet with. Zelensky, yes, is coming in October, in April, and is part of the sort of new trend in Africa-Ukraine relations, which was announced by the previous foreign minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba. He called it a renaissance in these in Africa-Ukraine relations. Keep in mind that Russia is still taking advantage of the Soviet-era legacy, when the Soviet Union was one of the harshest critics of the apartheid system here. The Soviet Union was friends with Indira Gandhi in India, and so as a result, we have India that is also kind of questionable when it comes to supporting Ukraine, and has, if not sided with Russia, then it has fully, maintained economic relations from Russia, has continued to buy its oil, and essentially, been that hole in the sanctions regime that has made them not effective enough in the past 3 years. Russia has also tried to use this kind of colonial narrative that, look, these Western powers, they were hell-bent and remain hell-bent on domination. Russia was never part of that project. Russia is waging this kind of global anti-Yankee, anti-imperialist war. It wants to liberate all of you. You should line up behind us. We should do it together. Ukraine is a puppet, etc. So they've turned their war of aggression against Ukraine into this sort of global jihad for for the rights of...
Interesting, Peter. And I always want to say this, that many of our freedom fighters here in South Africa during the struggle trained specifically in Ukraine. And whenever that conversation is being had, people conveniently forget that when we speak of the USSR's support of our struggle, many of our freedom fighters trained in Kiev and in Ukraine. And sometimes that particular detail is, conveniently missed out whenever we have our conversations in South Africa. But be that as it may, continue, please.
No, it brings me to that quote once again. A lot of the quotes have been attributed to Winston Churchill, whether it was his quote or not. But then he is said to have said that yesterday's fascists will become the fascists of today, meaning that if the Soviet Union was in some ways in its anti-Western struggle on the right page of history when it comes to apartheid and many other issues, it does not mean that it will always remain that fighter against fascism like it was in World War II. It's changed its colors, and right now it is Russia precisely that is waging a colonial war of aggression against Ukraine, and Ukraine is the one that is fighting against this, the neo-imperialism of Russia. So this is like Africa, 1962, the year of liberation. I think Ukraine is still stuck in that year. We thought that we were free of Russia starting in 1991, and we were very wrong and naive. So I think that message, and that's actually my mission here. I'm on a 40-country tour that will last for a year. I've already spent half a year in countries of South Pacific, in Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia. I've come here and I'm just starting my African journey that will take me overland all the way to Ethiopia and maybe even beyond, at least 20, 25 African countries. I'm here to engage with policymakers, with journalists, to talk about precisely that. Why the war in Ukraine matters for all of this world, what Ukraine is fighting for, and try to, take issue with and deconstruct Russia's claims that it has made.
What does it mean for us here in South Africa that we are making nice with Zelensky and Ukraine, having had a recent history of friendship with Russia in many ways, but also the recent aggression, at least diplomatically, from America against South Africa in the last few weeks. We've seen a whole lot of aggressive rhetoric by America towards South Africa. How do we as South Africans understand all of this geopolitical upheaval? And I'm looking specifically at the fact that we have a state visit by Zelensky next month. What does this mean for us here in South Africa from your perspective?
I'll have to be honest. We're living in a very confused world where what the actions and the words of the American president, such as you just mentioned, would naturally, you would think logically, push South Africa closer into the arms of Russia, right? Russia that would kind of take advantage of that. But at the same time, Vladimir Putin seems to be making allies and friends with Donald Trump. So it's a topsy-turvy world, and I would be kind of disingenuous, and I would be lying to you if I told you that I have the story straight. I will say one thing, though, when it comes to Zelensky visit. I think that your president and your government understand very well that Russia has been a significant disruptive force on the African continent. I'm talking about Niger, I'm talking about Mali, I'm talking about Cote d'Ivoire, Chad, and the Central African Republic, where coups have happened under, the tutelage, under the blessing of the Russians, that have resulted in the expulsion of Western military bases, etc. Right before the war against Ukraine, there was a big story in the New York Times about Wagner, the Wagner group, and Mr. Prigozhin, whom you've heard of, who were actually involved very much in staging an election, a certain election outcome in the neighboring country of Madagascar, on the island of Madagascar. This was right before this war. So I think that South African government understands that even though South Africa is a member of this grouping with Russia, BRICS, the original founding member, China, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, I think it has to keep Russia at a sort of arm's length distance, simply because of how devious Vladimir Putin is. And I think, this is, a smart move. Keep your options open, be a force for the good. And also, let me give you my very unscientific sort of opinion. I have not run any scientific polls of South Africans. I've spent here about a week. And let me tell you, just talking to people in Johannesburg and elsewhere, right now I'm in Durban, the overwhelming sympathy on the part of regular South Africans on the street, taxi drivers, etc., cooks, folks just passing by and asking where you're from. The overwhelming sympathy seems to be with Ukraine, but that's just my personal experience.
Will there be a lasting peace that'll emanate from these negotiations in Jeddah?
Not these negotiations. I think we're very far from that. And once again, don't forget it's a ceasefire negotiation. We're very far from a full peace agreement. I think I have a suspicion that as long as Putin is alive, we won't be talking about peace ever again.
Peter Zalmayev, thank you very much for your time, sir, and I appreciate you accepting our invitation to talk to us. Much appreciated. Peter Zalmayev, a Ukrainian American political commentator and journalist. Thank you very much.